Okay. Let's go ahead and have a seat, please. Let's see. Yes, this works. Morning, everyone. Thanks for coming, and I'm assuming no one was injured on the walkover. That's good. First of all, let me announce Steve is here. This is not a memorial. I've had several people, when they saw the title, said, "Steve, okay?" And yes, he certainly is okay. And this is also not a honorific kind of a thing. This is about dealing with a body of research that is what I think is so broad and so deep that we need help dealing with it. And in particular, people who aren't involved in research need help dealing with it. So this is about what does all this stuff mean and how do we apply it. So that's kind of the basis for what we're doing, and the basis for what I asked the other speakers to address. So we're going to start this morning with 5 talks. I'll start. Don Browning, Jay Anger, Heather Fruit, Andrew Jones, Scott Jones, sorry, is going to finish up, and then we'll have a discussion and we'll ask some questions. I guess I'm going to give the opportunity for the first question to Steve and see what he thinks, because we all care a lot. like Heather said, the guy we've always been trying to please is going to be the first questioner. So we'll see how it goes. I want to start kind of at the beginning, I think, of the life cycle, and talk about the importance of understanding shrub recruitment and seed dispersal. And in particular, I don't know, as you know, as a practicing professional, how many of you can trace your intellectual origins to one figure. And if you can, at least for me, this is it. I remember this, I don't know, it came out in 1989, but I think I remember it starting in 1983 in some form. I lived with this. And the one thing I do remember most was that when Steve first showed me this, it was a lot rougher, but that little thing right there was where I wanted to be. And it's pretty obvious that was where he wanted me to work, because obviously, if you look at that graph, that's the important part. So that's what we're going to talk about to start with this morning. And I would say that is just a conservative compilation of the referee journal papers that have addressed that space across multiple ecosystems. This is certainly not, this is just the work that was done by Steve and postdocs and students. So we, as they say about the cowbell, I think we explored the space here. And I'll cover some of those papers and take some extracts from them, and then finally finish up with what does that really mean. So I want to start with dispersal. This is the very first experiment that we did. The first thing we said was, how do these things get here? How did they get in? Well, you know, now they're everywhere, but how did they get there in the first place? And how will they get there in ecosystems that are not currently heavily occupied by shrubs? So we said, all right, let's just look at what's going on out there. We found a couple of locations where we could look at some mature trees. We looked at what was under the canopy. About 8 or 9% of the area was under a canopy of a seed-producing mesquite tree, leaving about 90% of that of those plots open. The seed rain was pretty equal underneath the canopy, but in the open, where livestock were, was a lot of seed. In the open where there weren't livestock, there were no seed. So livestock were dispersing the seed. What consequences did that have for seedlings and seedling recruitment? The beginning stage of that life cycle and what got us into that hatched area to start with. There were a lot of seedlings in the open, more seedlings in the open than under the canopy. None where there were no livestock. And that's the story right there. They were in dung piles. We did a lot of work with dung. I didn't know that. I didn't know that was the part of the job description, but it quickly became a focus. So I think that particular experiment really excluded a lot of the other things that we could have done as we looked at that process of seedling recruitment. So once we got seed into a location, and once it germinated, we wanted to know what the survival was. This is some data from College Station, about 1,000 millimeters annual precip. So about as mesic an area of rangeland as we work with. This is survival. This is emergence under different long-term grazing, long-term protection, short-term grazing or short-term biomass removal. And the only thing that seemed to hinder seedling emergence and establishment was very high layers of mulch. But even at that, it was around 5% of the seed that we put out came up. So really, nothing was going to stop these things once they got transported to a site by livestock. And then if we look at survival of the seedlings that came up here over 2 years in 84 to 85, the survival of those seedlings, I'd bet on them 90%. That's pretty good. We did something similar in La Capita in South Texas under a different rainfall regimes, one set of irrigated plots, one under natural. So we went anywhere from 500 millimeters of precip up until well over a couple of 1,000 millimeters of precip. And again, didn't seem to make much difference with emergence, what the surrounding treatment was. And it didn't really make any difference at all in survival. But once a seed got to a location via livestock dispersal, it was highly likely to germinate and extremely likely to survive and establish at least over the first couple of years. And from the literature that was around at the time, we knew that seedlings, once they made that first 2 or 3 years, were pretty much going to be with us forever. So, why? And this, I think this is some fascinating work from Nate Pierce, has done some work at the Jornada. This is some wind tunnel work that Nate did and looked at the water use efficiency of these shrubs and versus grasses. So here's 3 different shrubs, Atriplex, Lauria, and Prosopis in a wind tunnel experiment. There's Aristida, Botrycloa, and Sporobolus. And the thing that we see here is, number one, the seedlings of all those shrubs, and particularly mesquite, is much higher water use efficiency, even when they're being battered by wind and dust. And it also didn't decline nearly as quickly in response to being battered by the dust. So those seedlings were much better able to tolerate disturbance once they were established than the surrounding grasses. Same thing overnight. As those particles hit those seedlings and they hit those grass leaves, they actually lost, at least the way it was explained to me, they lost part of that cuticle layer. And they lost a lot of water overnight. Grasses lost a lot of water. Shrubs didn't lose much water. So they could tolerate disturbance. We saw in the earlier experiment, they could tolerate defoliation much better. And here they can tolerate disturbance much better. So a very good mechanism for survival of those shrubs. And that at least partially explains what those extremely high levels of survival are. I'll introduce Austin Rutherford, who has done some similar experiments and is going to kind of summarize some of those.
Thank you, Joel. Like I said, I'm Austin Rutherford. I'm a recent PhD with Steve. I did my research at the Santa Rita Experimental Range. Is here. So we went from the more mesic Texas to then the arid Jornada. Now we're going to more semi-arid Santa Rita Experimental Range, about 45 minutes south of Tucson. My field location is where that star is. We did an experiment where we manipulated precipitation. We had plots that received ambient rainfall, and plots that got 65% above ambient, so a wet year, and 65% relative reduction relative ambient, so a dry, extreme dry year. And we also manipulated granivores and herbivores, ants and small mammals, and then also clipping trees to simulate heavy livestock. I'm just going to highlight, this is from one of my chapters, and some of the primary findings that we found. So this is seed germination at the top here, across all the precipitation that we were able to get in this experiment, across from the extreme dry here to the extreme wet. And what we saw in the face of all that herbivory, we never reached 0% germination. This is survival down here. We never reached zero germination and zero survival. So no matter whatever experiments or treatments that we imposed, we got germination and survival. And after what Joel found in a lot of his experiments, and then interestingly, we found a plateau of survival and germination right around 240 millimeters, which is the mean annual precipitation for that site itself. So additional water did not help germination and survival of the seedlings. They were there and they were ready to keep going. This is work that we had a similar experiment that was done at the Jornada that I helped out with. Louise Weber Ron did this work, and he's found the same patterns that I did with that plateau right around the mean annual precipitation of that site, but his was closer around 100, 150 millimeters. Turning to those clipping treatments, this is seedling survival with a clipping or simulated heavy grazing, and no clipping or no grazing. First year seedling survival, we saw that those seedlings, it didn't matter. They established with grazing or without. And as we move into second year and then third year survival, we did see significant differences between clipping and no clipping, but we had more seedling establishment on those areas that were not grazed or not clipped, I should say. So without that grazing disturbance, we've actually wound up getting more seedling establishment. And this follows in vein of what Joel showed us earlier, that when the mesquite seedlings get there and they have the water to be able to germinate and establish, they take off. So now I'm going to tie this a little bit closely to some state and transition models from some of these research sites. On the left here is at the Santa Rita, Lonely Upland, 12 to 16-inch precipitation zone. And then on the right, Sandy Hills above Tucson. Just really want to point out that from this reference state, we're able to quantify or put numbers on these states of shrub canopy less than 5%. And then in the face of continuous heavy grazing and lack of fire, we start moving to that threshold, that shaded area that Joel pointed out in that initial figure. And then we U.S. large shrub state. One thing to point is that this is a straight line going directly from state to state. While looking at the Texas one, we have this line that goes back from mid tallgrass community to the shrubland state, where thinking about this continuous recruitment of mosquito, this seems to be more realistically and more management vision or applicable than this one, because you're going to get that continuous recruitment of mosquito year to year, and that we need to be cognizant that if you are going to try to revert back to that other state, it's going to take a lot more money and a lot more resources, and it's going to take a lot of work to get there. So that threshold is very important to monitor for, to pay attention for, where we have to keep an eye on those seedlings and maybe use things like the scrap fire to actually control those seedlings and stuff. All right.
Thanks, Austin. And I just wanted to kind of summarize here. First of all, say these experiments weren't just done at College Station, La Capita, Santa Rita, Jornada. These sets of experiments, these kind of experiments that were, I think, mostly spawned by this work, have been done now virtually all over the world. I know I basically took that figure to Australia and made hay with it for 5 years, just doing the same experiments over and over. And made a lot of progress there. So those experiments have inspired other experiments, as well as been validated by other experiments. And I think overall, what we came out of that with is that, and that first couple of points there, I think a lot of us now say, yeah, we knew that. Well, in 1989, we didn't know that. Or at least if we did, we didn't act like we knew it. And even today, some people are acting like they don't know those things, but there's a mountain of evidence that says we should know those things. And disturbance is necessary in these systems to keep the woody plants out. If we have a system, a rangeland system, where we don't have some kind of disturbance, and in this case, I mean managed disturbance, we are not going to keep shrubs out of it. Regardless of what we do, they're eventually going to show up and eventually dominate. Those disturbance regimes that are associated with those things can be captured in the dominant currency that we use to talk about management today, the state and transition models. That fits very well. And along those lines, I wanted to look more at this from a research context here. I don't think it's any coincidence that first paper came out in 1989, the same year that the Westerby Walker and Noemier paper came out that introduced the idea of state and transition models. However, in looking back at it, I think the Westerby Walker and Noemier paper, while revolutionary, was primarily observational and descriptive. And it, even though it relied on disturbance, it was kind of a generic model that a lot, people saw the potential in it, but land management's about details. And what this work that we're going to see this morning, and in particular this work, has done is it filled in those details. And it focused on not just detail, but important detail. So I think in one sense, that experiment and highly predictive work is complementary to that original Westerby et al. And really sort of propelled it forward. Without it, I don't think it would have gone where it's gone. So I think we really needed both of those things, and we're fortunate they happened at the same time. And I think it has certainly redirected the research community. You look in the literature prior to the mid-'80s, there wasn't a lot of seedling establishment work, especially in a semi-managed system in a natural environment. So I think that worked, and the people that worked in that hatched area, Steve, all the technicians, all the students, all the postdocs, we can be pretty proud of what has happened in that little space over the past 45 years. Thank you. Our next speaker, Dawn Browning. And Dawn, I'm going to let you sort of start talking while I think I can set this up. All right, I think we're good. And I'm assuming that if there's anyone who is on Zoom can't see what we're showing, I'll hear from you. Dawn?
Anyone that knows me might feel a little uncomfortable that I have a microphone this close to my mouth. Thank you, Joel, for organizing this session. And actually, Heather and I thought it was story time about Steve. So we got a little bit of a different presentation here. I'm just kidding. No, this is, it's actually been, it was an honor when Joel asked me to, I'm 7 months, to do this, because what it did was it gave me a beautiful opportunity to review the vast literature that Steve has been involved with directly or has subsequently inspired. And then from there, I pulled what I thought were the most compelling figures, and I'm going to frame it in the context of management. So I think I just went through my first slide. Yes. Okay. The other thing that I wanted to say, and it's really important, I think, and thank you for pointing out this isn't a memoriam for Steve. Thank you for being here. Is that I think it is important for time to look back on who has influenced us, what the early days, the inspiration, and where we're coming from as we move forward. So this is all part of that. So in Joel's genius to kind of set this up from a demographic or life stage standpoint, I'm here, the topic that I was kind of given to focus on are the interactions between trees and grasses, or trees and woody plants, trees and shrubs. So I'll be using those terms synonymously over the course of this talk. And so I'm going to provide a little bit of background, review what I think are the foundational works that have really spawned a lot of our thinking, pull out the highlights, as I mentioned, and then focus on the management implications of those. And then the applause at the end is optional, but I definitely want to plant that seed, a little bit of foreshadowing. So those of us here in this room, and even at this meeting in Boise and beyond, are well aware that rangelands are very complex landscapes. Not only is there this dual form, life forms, both the graminoids, herbaceous species, as well as woody plants that Joel kind of set us up so nicely to talk about the establishment stage. And so how and why the relative abundance of these two forms kind of shift over time is very complex. There's a lot of dependencies, if you will. And so this is demonstrated from a site at the Santa Rita, where I did my PhD work. So fondly looking at Austin's figures. And so this is not new to us here, but I kind of like to remind ourselves that this is happening in a lot of different places. So these shifts in the relative abundance of trees and grasses, or shrubs and grasses, has been happening long before we were here, or we were born, I should say. And so these changes are dynamic. They can happen fast, they can happen slow, but they've been happening for a long time in different kind of phases or cycles. So decades is normally what we think about if we're lucky, centuries and millennia. And so as this figure from it's a recent book, or a book chapter, is kind of really beautifully demonstrates. And so kind of to set the stage and kind of think about these traditional considerations, many of this isn't new to anyone in this room. With respect to, you know, why do we care? What is our emphasis? All the energy and the aspects for management and planning and monitoring. are really in one realm to focus on the production of livestock. But that's not the only thing. It is an important use indeed, but there are many others. Hydrology is a really lovely, important aspect that we're becoming increasingly aware of with prolonged drought, as well as wildlife, habitat and management, population management. The emerging considerations, and I just got like a little bit of a goosebumps because yesterday, 3 whole sessions on soil carbon. And very, very intriguing, exciting work and discussions that are going on. And this is not the first time that round of discussions has happened, but we are coming at it with renewed interest and definitely a great deal of zeal. And in many cases, money. So we're pressed to kind of think about those things. So the carbon sequestration is a really hot topic. Land surface atmosphere interactions, which is one of the arenas that I'm really enamored with right now, or very excited to be delving into in the realm of eddy covariance and looking at how wind that moves water and nutrients across the surface interacts with these different phases of vegetation and what that might mean for these different ecological states that Austin and Joel so beautifully kind of demonstrated in figures. And dust and pollen, aeolian processes, wind erosion is very, very, very important aspect of this, both for carbon and human health and climate. So these are the greatest hits, maybe in a sense. And I want to highlight the Scholes and Archer paper that Bob Scholes and Steve put together and published in 1997, was one of the most thoughtful presentations of all of the dynamics, right? Tree on tree, tree on grass, grass on grass, grass on tree, in the context of soil and climate. There's not a figure in this paper, which is astonishing if you know Steve, and it's pretty, but it was so really, really potent. I guess there's a lot of, and the Sankaran and the Eldridge papers were like, the Scholes and Archer paper was one of the first ones that was cited in the introduction to set the stage for these other works. These papers have been cited collectively over 3,000 times. And while that is an important impact metric, it's not the only one, right? It's how people in this room take that information, how it's used, how we conceptualize it and make it something that we can act on or discover with. So the hierarchy of drivers and constraints, this is something that when asked to kind of reflect on the time that I spent in Tucson in Steve's lab and under his tutelage, like this is kind of, I feel like this in the inverted pyramid, right? With these kind of very important hierarchical levels that are nested within one another. And these concepts aren't new necessarily, but I really kind of feel like it's important to understand the basis and kind of where they came from. So the interesting thing is these top 3, the climate, the geomorphology, and the topography, that's the basis for ecological sense, right? These are things that you can't change, right? That's what, with a particular place, that's what you got for the most part, right? What you can do and where the information and decisions come in is in this bottom level disturbance/management. That's where we spend most of the conversations and many of the talks that we're here to experience are focused in this realm and how those decisions might play out in the context of these other factors. Okay, so this was one figure from the House et al. Paper that I wanted to highlight, and this was the conundrums. This was one of my favorites to reread because of the way that the conundrums were shared. And I'm not going to go through each of them for the sake of time, but I did really feel that in this key figure, this is, if you recognize, this is the same information as in the inverted pyramid that we just saw, but it's expanded and it's written in a language and it's set up in a way that a predictive model can be and has been generated from these expressions or these ideas. And so the boxes, the blue and the green, is where I spend a lot of my time still to this day as a researcher and thinking about how climate change might influence state transition. And then the tree versus grass, which is, I guess, the emphasis of my talk or what I'm sharing here, is in that green box. And so these things are nested, but they're contextualized in a really great way. And I think that's one of the greatest strengths in many ways of Steve's work. So I wanted to highlight another really compelling figure from a paper that Steve and Katie Predick published in 2014 in the Journal of Ecology that kind of did a meta-analysis of all of the papers that reported quantitative outcomes from brush management. So while there might have been 1,300 papers that came up in the search in the meta-analysis, only 364 had quantitative data on what happened after the treatment. And this is where we spend a lot of time thinking about these things. And these, in the context of this really fantastic paper, was really kind of in the realm of ecosystem services. So can we put the data that we have, the best data that we have, in the context of things beyond livestock raising, which is important, but there's many other ecosystem services to consider. And so the main thing that I wanted to demonstrate, I wanted to highlight two things. Steve, so great with figures and kind of, you can see something and instantly know what the idea is. So that's a really fantastic attribute, which you see here with the grassland to shrubland states, with encroachment going in the downward direction on the left side, and brush management ideally going on the right side in the upward direction. What I really want you to look, if you focus on the symbols, the plus, minus, and question marks, for woody prone encroachment, there's no clear loser. It's not a loss of ecosystem services necessarily. You don't know, no tomatoes, but like that, the idea is like, can we think about this a little bit differently? Are there other services that we might consider? Now, I'm not saying don't do brush management, but the idea is like, if we look more broadly and objectively at a broader suite of services, brush management might not be as bad as we think it is. And in another figure from this paper, that demonstrated essentially what I just mentioned, like these are standardized metrics, or a conceptual representation of the standardized metrics of what happened after the brush management treatment. And so there is a decrease in, there is a decrease in the woody cover or production, but then it takes time. There's a lag for the herbaceous response to happen. Now we know this. People are shaking their heads, yes. But this is kind of like from a meta-analysis perspective, it's important. This is where the geomorphology, the climate, the soils come into play to understand what these lags might be. T1, T2, T3, T4. And the important thing is that the brush management treatment needs to be repeated to be effective. Just as Joel said, we have to actively manage to keep the shrubs from increasing in cover production dominance. But there is a point where they come back. And so I wanted to just kind of point out, like, retreatment is necessary for brush management. But if you couple that with grass restoration, then following the brush management, then you hopefully, or maybe get a different outcome. And I'm sharing this because this is the impetus for one of the experiments that we have on the Jornada today, the Dune and Restoration Experiment, or DIRC. And so we're basically actively we're drawing on these principles and this knowledge and implementing it just to see if we can get reestablishment of grasses in areas that are shrub dominant currently. So those are my highlights and implications in drawing it back to why it's important to know this, where it came from. And I have to put my personal spin on this. And so, pardon me, Steve. Let's see. So I wanted to share a few what I call archerisms, but really I would say these are things that I didn't actually realize that I learned until I reflected on from working with Steve, both 6 years as a PhD student, but then also subsequently had the pleasure of working with him since I'm a researcher at Jornada. Assumptions, check them, right? Make sure, be aware, check your assumptions, or check the assumptions. B, bias, acknowledge it. And this was very interesting as I reread some of these papers. There is a very clear acknowledgement of bias, which isn't all that common. I know I'm going to start working a little harder to do that in my talks and papers. because we all have it. We can't say that we don't. C is create compelling contextual information. So this kind of goes back to the figures and the models that are both conceptual, but also predictive. And so that's a really great mark of Steve and his work on all that he's influenced and done, as in get it. and like even demonstrating that yesterday to get here in the Phoenix airport, stuck for 9 hours. So get it done. So yeah. And I guess there's a few more things that I'd like to add, and maybe on a more personal note. Number one is Steve, you have this incredible talent to eloquently communicate complex principles in a way that people can understand. And I still to this day strive to do that better. And again, the models are conceptual as well as predictive, which is a big step forward, considering the example of the Westaby 1989 paper and Steve's 1989 paper. And I've not met another scientist who's as humble and generous with ideas as you. And so I think we could all take a page from that playbook. I think it would be better if we did, or I'm going to speak for myself. But it really is a true mark of a great scientist to take the time to nurture or mentor those that may not be as far along, and do so in a compassionate way and getting things done in the meanwhile. And I wanted to say that I've landed well, and I had to put this little chuckle in here. I didn't have any funny pictures of Steve on my phone, unfortunately, but I did have this one of my colleagues at the Jornada. And we kind of embody at many of these aspects, and Steve's work certainly has influenced what we're doing today. And we do know how to have fun, especially when it rains. And so I wanted to leave you with that, and hopefully Brandon's not in the room. Okay. I didn't get permission to share that photo. Thank you so much. If there,
While I'm moving presentations over, any questions for Dawn?
anybody? Come on. You know, originally I was like, oh, wow, that's a big act. Like that's a large task. But really, I guess what made it easier was the tree grass interactions by focusing specifically on that particular topic. And then talking with colleagues. I spoke with a number of colleagues. In fact, I want to acknowledge Nate Pierce, who was a really great person to kind of converse with a little bit about this too. And so that kind of led to some of the top of them. And there were just so many that I just picked on to pick forward. Yeah, thank you for acknowledging that. So this is the book chapter in the 2017 book compiled by Dave Brisky. And and in fact, Joel, when we were talking about this talk, he was like, Dawn, it's 100 pages. Just summarize that in 15 minutes and you're good. But I agree. It is an incredible piece of work. So.
Thanks, Dawn. Dawn mentioned the importance of models. And, you know, for anyone who works in applications, programs, policy, we know that we are overly reliant on models, and we love them. But I think one mark of Steve and his collaborators' works is that the models are pretty good. And the models they're very difficult to deal with, and they're also pretty good. And another thing I noticed, Steve, is that for some reason, most of the people that worked on the modeling part of this deal are overseas. Now, I don't know what that means, but well, actually, one of them said, "Get the hell out of there" or something. Anyway, but I was fortunate enough to find a contemporary of mine in graduate school that really understood the modeling part and how much work has gone into these models and ultimately what they mean. So Dr. Jay Anger.
Well, start out by saying I'm a little intimidated, you know, feel like I'm giving my thesis defense again, so. With faculty members and Steve and others, so. Anyway, well, what I want to talk about today is, work that Steve has done and how it's influenced our ability to do better modeling, better understanding of these systems. And some of this is going to be a little bit of a repeat from what Dawn has already presented this morning, but maybe that's repetition will help too. So, but I'd like to talk about many of these, or a subset of these conceptual frameworks or models that Steve has developed, and some of the simulation modeling that he has done with some of his students, and then look at some of those important works and see how they can be used to inform our process models or have informed process models and adaptive management strategies. So Joel shared a set of slides that Steve provided him that said could be kind of used for this talk. And so for the approach that Steve uses in you know, tackling a study or looking at woody plant encroachment, ones I'm going to talk a bit about here would fall into this long-term monitoring and remote sensing, and then the modeling with state and transition and dynamic simulation. But one of the things I like about this figure is that it shows that you can't ignore these other parts and that they feed into that, and that you know, this is a big part of modeling itself too, is that you can't forget some of these things. In models, you tend to gloss over some things sometimes, but you need to be paying attention to that. And I think this is an excellent way to display that. So I'm going to start at the beginning of how it started and start with the paper that Steve had in Ecological Monographs. This was research that was conducted in South Texas, and they used time series aerial photography and field data to look at this part of that transition that is in the figure that Joel showed there, and looking at the before and after that. And, you know, so for that, they had, this is the landscape there in South Texas, that looking at the transition between these clusters of shrubs, and do they converge into these woodland areas that are in more of the drought area, and then over time do you have a loss of that herbaceous areas here, and losing production for livestock in that. So I thought this figure here was an excellent figure. I know it's very hard to see, but from the start to the end here, he defined many processes and different things that could occur along that pathway from going from herbaceous to the closed woodland. And so many of us, Joel, we worked on different parts of these. Here's the part about the seed dispersal and growth. I worked on some of the aspects of the amelioration and the changes that occur in that. And so over time, I don't know how many of these you've checked off, Steve, but I'm sure quite a few. But this is his first or the thing that he produced in one of his first major papers, and it was a roadmap for all of us to go from there. And so I think that's a very good example for young folks here to be able to look at that and see that he mapped it out and he worked on that from the start. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the work that he and Joe Scanlon did. Joe happened to be one of the students that was there when I was there, and I saw the many nights that he spent in our place we called the dungeon working on this. We had one computer and we had to all schedule our time to work on it. So anyway, so for Joe to do this, I know when he, in his graduate school part of it, he had to make sure he scheduled the time for the computing and that. And so what he was working on was using this time series aerial photography and rainfall records to develop a model that he could simulate how wet periods and dry periods would affect this woody plant encroachment. And so he developed these probabilities from the aerial topography to be able to look at those changes from the different states, and then looked at the long-term rainfall records to be able to develop these probabilities of change. And so from that, they built a simulation model to mathematically go through that and look at what would happen over time. And also looked at it backwards to see if they could recreate what happened over time. So the big result of this is that assuming similar climate and management over that time, over the area, that after about 180 to 200 years, this would develop into a closed canopy woodland. And those changes couldn't reverse unless there were changes in climate or management. So I want you to look at this here. This graph goes from 1700 to 2100. And then this is the proportion of the area that is covered by these different types. And so over time, this it's predicted that this woodland, that the woodland area would increase, the number of pioneer clusters would decline, and then you'd have this decline in the herbaceous zones. So we'll follow that, and this is some work of Brad Wilcox's student, Shashir Basant, that looked at these changes and how they affect hydrology over time. But I just want to use the figure to visually show what has happened over time here. And so these are the drainages of woodland, and then these areas here with the shrub clusters. And in the 50s, some of these look like they declined a bit. The 50s were the drought periods in South Texas and a lot of other parts of the US. So then to 1995, Joe and Steve's data went to 1984. So this is another 10 years after that. And, there's some disturbance that occurred at the La Copita during that time where they put in some areas for energy exploration to look for things. But you can still see that these drainages are widening and that these shrubs are increasing in size and the clusters are increasing in size. So I took that area, since it's so well marked up, to see if I could find it on Google, and got the latest imagery from 2020. And you can see that there has been a tremendous change in that time, and these woodland areas have increased, and the coalescence that's described in many of Steve's articles is occurring. And so I took it one step further and went to the rangeland analysis platform. And if you're not familiar with that, it is a tool that they've developed using field data, remote sensing data, Landsat in particular. And from that field data and remote sensing data, they have been able to develop a fractional cover estimates for all of the Western US. Well, now it's for the whole US for rangelands, and breaks it down into bare ground, herbaceous cover, and shrub and shrub and tree cover. So what I did is, for that area that was listed here, I took that area and put it into the graph tool and looked at woody versus herbaceous cover over time. And this is from 1984 to 2021, and then just put fitted a line to it. You can see that since 1984, there's been a steady increase in shrub cover there. Some of the droughts here in 2011 and 12, there was some decline, but over time it's caught back up and increased. And this decline in herbaceous cover during that time. So what I want to point out from that is that Steve and Joe predicted this in 1984. I mean, from 1984 data, and it's manifesting here. And it would be an interesting study to look at this again and add that new time period to it and see if the rates have changed in that time. And this hasn't only occurred at La Capita in South Texas. Here's the general footprint of La Capita. This is a paper from Morford et al. That was recently that used the RAP data to look at woody plant cover increases. And as you can see in most of Texas, rangelands have had increased shrubs. Some in the La Capita area that range from about 12 to 24 plus. But across the state, there are areas where that change is occurring and having big impacts. So another point from this is that now we have tools that we can look at this and provide early warning in that. But Steve was there and Joe were back there in 1989 saying you're having some problems that we need to be looking at. So in that point, as Joel mentioned, this area is very important and that threshold. And so once you cross into this area where you're a shrubland, some of these things that you could make changes with become very hard. And for people at this level, like what we're seeing potentially in that figure where trees and shrubs have increased, you're probably going to be spending most of your time over here. Your time or cultural energy, that means time, money, lots of resources to go into that and to get you back to that crossing that. And so to me, this is an area you probably don't ever want to be in. So it gets expensive and time consuming. So Don had presented this. From a modeling standpoint, this is extremely helpful. I worked with a team at Texas A&M that developed a tool to look at what is depicted here and be able to put that in the context of an economic analysis. So you would have some expectation that your forage would increase after a herbicide or a mechanical treatment, and then you out here you're probably going to have to do some retreatment. And if we provided options for people to look at whether they did a retreatment or not. And so it's very important to have this kind of model to be able to do that and data that can help support that because in the case of this model, we were trying to help producers be able to decide if they needed to do the treatment, whether they could afford to do it. But one thing to point out is in the majority of the cases of things that we looked at and the producers that we worked with, this increase was not enough to pay for the herbicide treatment. And it generally required a cost share from NRCS or where else. So now that involves us as taxpayers. So that cost share was very important to be able to get that to a level that people could be able to afford it. And because you're not going to be able to pay for it generally with the forage increase that you're going to get from the herbicide. So that was an important thing to include in the model and be able to look at that. So, and as was pointed out, retreatments are generally needed. So in that previous figure, if you want to stay on the other side of that threshold, you have some work to do there too. So then it was mentioned about carbon. So from the standpoint of carbon sequestration, there's models that are being built and some things that were pointed out and Barger, Archer et al. Were talking about what brush management could do to carbon storage and looking at that increasing woody plants and how disturbances can impact that can lead to losses or gains in carbon. So from a modeling standpoint, we need to be able to incorporate those kind of changes or those impacts into our carbon models. So one of the results of their work in that was that they found that woody plant encroachment generally results in net carbon gains, but those disturbances can lead to losses. And they, again, provided a nice conceptual model here for us to be able to look at that and be able to think about that from a modeling standpoint of the woody plant encroachment and the above ground carbon stocks. And then you have some mechanical treatment and you can get back to some level But if you do these retreatments, you may be keeping it at a lower level. So if you're in some kind of carbon sequestration program, you may want to be able to have a way to take that into consideration, because sometimes those the traditional management, it doesn't always coincide with being able to sequester. So just again, another repeat. All of this is very complex, and being able to model it, you need to be able to have the data and be able to understand the processes to do it correctly. Steve's group and collaborators and students have done a lot to answer some of these questions. There's still a lot of question marks in there. So I think that's a foundation for us to build off of. And he's shown us the way to be able to do predictions. So models and being able to look at these in a quantitative manner will certainly be helpful. So his research has provided a solid foundation for us for our future work. As was pointed out, his ability to develop figures and conceptual models and that are extremely helpful in developing the models and moving forward with those. And we hope we can build on your legacy, Steve, and just continue to do good work and solve the problems that we face on rangeland worldwide. So thank you.
Thanks, Jay. Any questions for Jay while I set the next talk up? A lot of what we found out. Thanks, Jay. And we'll have time for some discussion at the end. As I was putting this together, I got a list of collaborators, and this is not about Heather. This is just this. I just had this story to work in. One of my colleagues looked at the list and said, "Whoa, I don't know how you're going to get that organized. There's a lot of prima donnas in there." And I thought about it for a minute and I said, well, hell, we're all prima donnas. So that's not going to be that hard. And I think that's one thing that maybe Steve sort of pushed us all toward. And then Dawn made me think about it with her last slide was humility. I think what we'd be as a group, we would all think of ourselves as humble prima donnas. So, and if there's anyone that embodies that, it's Heather Fruit.
Well, I'm not quite sure where to start now. This was already a kind of hard talk for me to put together. So I've struggled, right? I absolutely, I was super excited when Joel asked me about this. Absolutely, I want to participate, and great honor to do this and to be able to pick up. I love the structure that Joel had come up with, and that I could sort of pick up with thinking about shrub grass. And I'll use mostly the term woody encroachment for meaning this transition from grassland to shrubland. And then pushing this into now thinking about what does this mean from the ecosystem consequences. So that was all very exciting. But as I started to think about like this weighed very heavily on me, right? And I'm thinking like, how could I possibly do this, right? So I've now been collaborating with Steve for 20 years since I pursued a postdoc with him, and there's just like so much work in this realm from before I worked with him, and then so much additional, and I still find it very overwhelming. So I'm going to do my best here. And so as I struggled with this, I thought, well, what would Steve do? Well, Steve would come up with a conceptual model. You guys, we've already talked about that, right? So I'm thinking, okay, so what can I do? Like the Archer career model, like woody encroachment. So maybe there's time on the x-axis. This is a good way to start. Maybe something sort of patterns, right, as we're going from grassland to shrubland. And as it certainly wasn't the beginning of Steve's career, right? Has lots of other work, but right, this was sort of early in his Texas A&M days. So then there was a lot of work documenting this patterns of woody encroachment rates and patterns, right? So this was some is really important early work. We've already seen some examples from this 1989 paper where, and I think this from here we can see this really remarkable but consistent pattern in Steve's work, and that is really thoughtful, detailed, incredibly detailed field measurements, right? But then coupled with math, right? Mathematical models of different kinds. And so looking at here field data coupled with modeling projections, looking at the estimated age of clusters of shrubs under different climate conditions, right? Okay, so you've seen this again before in the last couple talks, but right, this is right, the Archer touch, then putting it all together into a beautiful and really, thoughtful, comprehensive conceptual model. So, but then, Steve has kept thinking about this in different directions, looking at different woody encroachment trajectories, right? Seeing that the world is not linear, right? We can't just think of this linear projection, but thinking in multiple dimensions, right? That these are highly spatial, there's spatial heterogeneity, right? So this is another really important theme. And so we might kind of see this being a transition, but then we also have to think about other dimensions and even like, right, 3 dimensions, right? So what's going on like below the soil, right? And the structure of the soil at multiple layers and how that influences these patterns, right? So we can think of this, I thought first, okay, so maybe we're kind of going linearly here, right? And so getting this deeper understanding of woody encroachment. Of course, looking through my old photos, which I found a few things there. One is apparently Steve never wears long pants out in the field, or according to my photos. The other thing that I was looking through, it was like, there's not a lot of people, there's quite a few people here who've been in the field. Like, what is Steve saying right now? It's like, well, while we're out here, like we could measure this too. Like, I'm sure it was while we're out here, like, let's measure this cactus is falling over, because it would be interesting. And then we'd end up with some whole other project having to do with that. So, right. So this is, well, while we're out here. And so this conceptual model, I have to say, then I end up thinking like, but it's going to look like this, right? Which is like the reality of the Archer career model in a really wonderful way. And this then gets us to some really, has moved us to some sort of deep breadth in understanding the system as a whole. Okay, but my brain is a little bit more simple. So It's like, okay, what else can I do? Okay, because so I'm gonna go with the Archer submodel here, right? Woody encroachment impacts on ecosystems. We're just gonna focus a little bit down on that. So thinking about then maybe something going from patterns to larger ecosystem scale implications on the y-axis. So we can start with these patterns. And then we've got this edaphic heterogeneity, right? Thinking in multiple dimensions. And then thinking, okay, so what are the consequences of woody encroachment? And from Steve's lab, right, there's been just some really beautiful early work on this. Work with Kathy Hibbard when she was a graduate student, looking at, say, pattern pools of plant tissue, and then thinking about that. What does that mean in terms of biogeochemistry? So here we have on the left panels here looking at root biomass. And then not only just how does that differ in different vegetation patches, right? Considering that spatial heterogeneity, but how do those change through time, right? So looking at variation through time and multiple years, right? And then looking at on the panel to the right here, looking at what does this mean in terms of nitrogen dynamics? How do those change in different patches, right? Through space and through time, right? So again, it's really consistent themes of space and time. And then Rebecca McCauley also did work sort of in these same themes, thinking about these different patch types, grass versus shrub dominated areas, how they differed right through time with rainfall, looking at soil respiration, and how's carbon cycled differently through these systems as a result of those spatial and temporal patterns. Okay, so we can go back to our model here, and we're kind of like, moving up in this trajectory and thinking about different patch types. Ooh, and then it gets like super long scale, right? As we start to some of Kathy Hibbard's work, again, thinking like using the century models to look over thousands of years. How do these trajectories play out, right? But coupling really elegantly coupling these like demographic models. So based on that detailed field understanding of plant growth and demographics and what species replace each other, right? Coupling those with a complex biogeochemical model to be able to understand these large scale changes over time and try to understand what does this mean in terms of long-term carbon and nitrogen dynamics. And then bringing in things like some remote sensing work with Greg Asner, of course, linked with the conceptual model of how do these patterns change over time, right? And management, and so management impacts come in here of different brush management impacts. And then on the y-axis here, we have regional carbon pools. And then there's another line of work, and a lot of this was in collaboration with Tom Boughton, right, using stable isotopes to determine soil carbon inputs. So both sort of approaching the soil carbon work from understanding the dynamics of the plants, but then also using the stable isotopes to understand, well, what are the carbon-13 signatures of soils in different places, right? Looking through space, and then trying to use that to mathematically estimate, well, how much of that carbon is from plants with different photosynthetic pathways. So how can we use these multiple lines of evidence to try to understand the landscape through time? Okay, so then we can add on, right? We've got these biogeochemical models, expansion through time and space, remote sensing. And then there's some of these just kind of spin off in other directions, right? There's whole other lines of evidence, and Dawn talked a little bit about some of this, right? And then we've got stable isotopes, right? That's also a whole other set. Okay, and then somewhere in here, so Steve also moved, right? From Texas to Arizona, started working at the Santa Rita experimental range. I came in at this point, just about the same time that Steve moved to Tucson. I started my postdoc there. There's several of us who are considerably older at this point. And this Santa Rita, I think, opened up some other pathways for Steve's work. That there's really just this sort of gold mine of possibilities at the Santa Rita, based on some really unique characteristics of that site. So you've already seen some iteration on this figure from Dawn, but we have this really well documented history at the Santa Rita through a series of repeat photos, right? So we can see through time, how the vegetation has changed. Right? And so this led to the possibility to do a bunch of really cool things there from an ecosystem context. So we had a series of studies where we looked at, say, you know, how do shrubs, well, shrubs aren't all the same, right? So it matters how big shrubs are, right? We can't just equate them as all being the same. And so if we're going to try to look at and project total changes in carbon, it matters, well, what are we looking at in terms of size? So we can look at different sizes of plants. And then also it's the canopy is not uniform. The soils are not uniform underneath the canopy. So it matters where we core, what soils we take, and we can sort of basically get almost any conclusion we want about the impacts of soil of woody encroachment on soil carbon dynamics if we don't take into account those spatial patterns, right? So we can come up with 3D models and then Hershey's Kiss models of how shrubs impact soil carbon. And then Steve did work with grad student Winston Wheeler, looking across. There's a major climate gradient within the Santa Rita, which is then overlaid on top of multiple soils, which then allows the ability to then ask these questions right across these different soils and then under different rainfall regimes, and then try to really understand, again, sort of finessing those understandings of how do shrubs impact soil carbon. Okay, so we can add those in, right? So it's, whoops, we're getting a little bit crowded here in terms of the model. I'm not sure we're getting it. It's not quite the elegant Archer model. But then this is the problem. Then there's always these like, well, hey, while we're at it, things, right? Of like, well, while we're at it, oh, you know, management, I mean, it's not really just a while we're at it, right? This is like a really, really important part of like, you know, what are the management implications? So it's, and so can we explore all of these same questions, but say thinking about, well, if we put livestock in the context of changing shrub sizes and the length of time that shrubs have been there and the locations under shrubs, and what does that matter? And so can we kind of come up with these same models, but also understanding what happens with when there are grazers there, or what happens with brush management at different times since shrubs have been killed, times since they've resprouted, those kinds of questions, right? Across climate gradients, right? Trying to really understand these questions. So we can add these in to our model as well. And then, of course, then there's all these other, right? We could go infinitely here into all these other, while we're at it, right? We have this whole other long series of work thinking about, well, what are some of the processes that change these patterns of soil carbon, right? So for example, this very much was a, well, while we're at it, we'll do a little small scale experiment that I've spent a fair portion of the last 20 years working on, which is, how does the modification of land cover of woody plants influence the environment, the surface environment, right? The amount of erosion on the surface, and how does that influence decay of organic material on the surface, and then how does that influence soil carbon? So we have those kinds of questions, right? And so we can add those on, and then I realized and there would be so many more, and I basically decided I was going to run out of time at this point. So I just decided this is basically, more or less I've failed, right? It's too complicated because Steve has done too much. So I decided I'll just distill it to that, right? That this work has really been, has led to some really major accomplishments in our understanding of how this relationship between shrubs and grass impacts ecosystems, and in particular, really, coupling that really field-based knowledge of understanding, right? What are those patterns through space and time, coupling that with different kinds of modeling to project patterns. And then really importantly, like bridging some of these disciplinary gaps between science and management, and really considering the management implications along with, as a really critical part of the science. So But then I thought, but if I think of Steve, that's still not really satisfying, because I think there's another really important element of Steve's career here that has been mentioned as well, and that is that, right, there's another submodel. And that's a really, really critical submodel, and that's the Archer submodel of cultivation of students and postdocs. So that there has been, and that there's bias here in my figure that this is mostly more recent, the last 20 years. Well, this is not even at all comprehensive of the last 20 years, but right, this just amazing number of students and postdocs and who have been influenced in various ways by Steve and his passion for science and his high standards for science. And then I realized that there's still like another dimension. We really need to add another submodel. And that is behind all of this, and I think all of the people who have worked with Steve as a student and as a postdoc know that there is this other element, and that is Gwen Archer, who has just been an amazing part of this and has helped us all out in many ways as we collaborated in science and thinking about management and developing scientists. Steve can answer all my
Okay,
questions.
I think we've got time for at least one, maybe two questions while I set up the next presentation. So, question for Heather? Heather, I have a question, and it was brought up earlier that at this meeting, I think we have at least 4 workshops or symposia and at least one special or one contributed session on carbon counting, carbon management. Do you have any thoughts about how to get this? And I mean, I have been in that for a long time. The carbon stuff that you presented and we've been working on for decades is nowhere near getting incorporated into these ideas about how do we use rangelands for global scale carbon management. Do you have any? I mean, obviously, you can't even make sense out of what one guy did. But you might hit it. So I think not just for you, but for everybody here. I mean, this is not just, and it's not just this, but in particular, we're sitting on a mountain of research about how these ecosystems work. And we haven't even scratched the surface of how do we use that information to make these big decisions about things like greenhouse gas management. It has become the province of hucksters, and the scientists are completely left out of it. How would you think we can get that in there?
Yeah. Well, I think, I mean, the first step is maybe more of this integration, right? We've done a great job with it, right? In terms of really that there's a lot of, we have failed in, we've had sort of segmented, isolated communities, right? Not thinking about, you think about sort of the carbon people working in one realm and sort of more management perspectives in another. And but it's getting better in terms of having a lot more discussion in between. But now then we also have the monetization of carbon, which often is perhaps there's not a lot of motivation based on science, right? But that's our obligation, and also part of it.
Okay. All right. Good. Thank you. Very nicely done. One of the real pleasures of the last couple of years for me has been the opportunity to work with Steve's current and what I think most people say would be his last two graduate students. Austin, who presented earlier, and Scott Jones. And just to see what these guys are doing and to see there's been no decline in the level of rigor or enthusiasm that I see in these two compared to the first two or three. And I think that is pretty important. And it's really been a pleasure to work with them in putting this together and just interact with them in general. So to sort of finish us off before we go into a discussion period, Scott's going to talk about how we account for these ecosystem services in this work.
Thank you. Before I begin to, Heather, I was laughing when you're talking about conceptual models, because 2 weeks ago, I messaged Austin, texted him, and I said, hey, going through some of Steve's old work for this presentation, and one thing's for sure, the dude really loves a good conceptual model. So yeah, my name's Scott Jones. I am hopefully, fingers crossed, Steve's last graduate student. And over the past couple of years, Steve and I have been working at spatial temporal patterns of the encroachment process, the impacts this has on ecosystem services, as well as the social component of what people actually want from these landscapes. If you're unfamiliar with the term ecosystem services, they're basically the benefits humans receive from the environment. Traditionally, rangelands have been overlooked on the types of ecosystem services they supply. This is mostly because a lot of them are hard to put into a market value, so therefore they're overlooked. But recently, these rangelands have been identified as like, hey, they actually supply most of these different ecosystem services to a variety of different stakeholders. So maybe we should start paying attention to them. And one of the largest impacts to ecosystem services is the land cover change. You know anything about Steve? It's going to be shrub encroachment, right? So Joel brought up, there's that one conceptual model that really got you sparked and interested in your current research. And this, as we've all seen today, is actually mine. I remember reading this. Steve sent me a preprint of the copy, and I was like, oh my gosh, someone's thinking about this dynamic way ecosystem services change, the way our management impacts them, and how there's these trade-offs that exist between it. So for this talk, I thought I would spend some time talking about this guy right here's work on how he has addressed a number of these ecosystem services that are provided by rangelands. And I think I should make a caveat here. Steve has like an entirely huge catalog based on publications that would directly relate to how we can help manage and monitor ecosystem services. So just kind of scratching the surface on the projects I'm going to talk about. So the first one would be above ground carbon. Heather introduced this a little bit, but the work he did with Greg Asner, looking at long-term changes to above ground carbon stocks with the encroachment process. And what they found is from 1937 to 2000, you saw about a 32% increase in this above ground stock. So as encroachment happens, you tend to see this above ground carbon increase on the landscape. But interestingly, this isn't uniform across the landscape. So there's some strong edaphic controls based on where encroachment is happening. So you'll have more carbon, say, on clay loams compared to shallow clays. As well as the management history of those areas, they found if an area had been treated with fire or past herbicide, it actually had less carbon on the landscape. He also had other works that followed up on this, looking at the edaphic controls on carbon stocks, above ground carbon stocks. And I think this is really interesting because, you know, the dynamic here of, you know, you tend to have more carbon from shrubs on these clay loams, but interestingly, the herbaceous above ground biomass actually decreased on these clay loams. But if you look at shallow clays, as shrubs encroach, you actually see above ground herbaceous biomass increasing. So on to below ground soil carbon and total nitrogen. Heather brought up this project as well, where they took soil samples all along different areas of grasslands, areas that had some shrubs on it, and then areas that had fully converted into these groves. And what they found is, you know, like above ground, below ground soil carbon was about 2 times higher, same with the nitrogen. And then you had higher soil respiration, microbial mass, and because it's a nitrogen fixture, you have more nitrogen mineralization. Moving on, then Heather with these Hershey kisses, but really interestingly, this isn't uniform even at the shrub level. So if you're looking at just at the soil carbon at the bowl, it's actually going to decrease as you move away from that bowl. So one of their main conclusions with that is that if we're using just these common non-area weighted models to look at carbon, we could be overestimating by like 30% if we extrapolate it across the entire landscape. So these are all, ecosystem functions, processes here. So how does this actually relate to like management, what Joel was getting at? How do we actually make this relevant? Well, we do have a number of ecosystem service monitoring tools or modeling tools. And these two, I don't want to bash on them too much. They do an okay job at like a global level. But the way it would work is you would take like a land cover map right here. This is a National Land Cover Database layer. And you would put this into the model. And then you would also put a database in there of like how much above carbon is on each one of these land cover classifications. So if you look at this though, we've learned there's so much variability across the landscape based on what type of soil type shrubs are growing on, how grasslands, grass cover will be different on these topoedaphic constraints as well. So going forward, a lot of Steve's work could be placed into these models to make them much more accurate. We could start breaking down, this is shrub cover on lowland ecotypes or clay ecotypes. Then we could have these carbon layers or values in there, and we could actually start to make these carbon models more relevant, especially if we're going to try to create these for a sequestration markets across rangelands. Let's see what else. So most recently, Steve's work before he retired, he was part of a project that looked at brush management's impacts on ecosystem services at the Santa Rita. So what they did is they took a couple sub watersheds and they used one and sprayed with an aerial application of herbicide. And then through that tracked a number of different ecosystem services and how they changed. And one of these was net primary productivity. And one thing that they found, which is really interesting, is 1 year after doing this this management effort, is that you saw this about 25% increase on net primary production, but that actually wasn't equal on what was moving into the landscape. And they found that most of this increase in herbaceous primary production was actually through layman's lovegrass moving into the system, and taking over these areas that were once covered by shrub. And then another thing that they found is the following year, between the control site and their managed site, is that primary production actually evened out, and it's because they went through a drought. So this also kind of shows you that you can do these management efforts, but the timing of when you do them, where you do them, and then what's on the landscape previously will all kind of account for how the system will respond. And if you go into a dry year right after doing a treatment, you may lose all of this, the benefits you get from doing this brush management project. He was also involved in doing a synthesis of looking at a lot of other projects that looked at how primary production can be impacted. And a couple takeaways from this is that as areas that are really dry versus semi-arid versus more temperate locations, you tend to get different responses to this brush management efforts, brush management projects. So they found in more like semi-arid regions, you tend to get an influx of primary production, where like in hyper-arid or arid regions, you tend to get maybe a decrease in the amount of primary production that's on the landscape. And then ultimately, if you look over on the far side over here, you can see years after management treatment. So you tend to get this flush in primary production, but then over time, you tend to level back off and see kind of where you started from the beginning. So these aren't, long-term solutions if you go in and treat one time. Also following up with, herbaceous diversity on these systems, and it follows a similar pattern. When you're in more arid environments or semi-arid environments, you tend to increase the herbaceous biodiversity following a brush management effort, compared to maybe if you're in a more forested, like pinyon juniper, pinyon pine, juniper system, where you could actually see a decrease in the amount of herbaceous biodiversity on the landscape. So from a management perspective, where you're treating, if you're trying to increase diversity, it's really important to be aware of the type of environment you're treating in. And then also this long-term view that one-term treatment, you may get a flush in increased primary production, you may increase herbaceous biodiversity, but ultimately that will probably level off and return where it was before the treatment. Part of my research, Steve and I have been interested in looking at species-specific changes to the shrub encroachment process. And one of these is pronghorn, because we feel it is a great proxy for healthy grasslands, as pronghorn are very susceptible to obstructions in their vision. And therefore, when shrubs move in, they don't like it, they avoid those areas. So what I did here with Steve is we classified, this is a semi-arid grassland in southern Arizona, not the Santa Rita. I'm the oddball. I don't do the work in the Santa Rita. This is the watershed west of it, or east of it, of Las Ciénegas. This is Las Ciénegas National Conservation Area. And what I did is I tracked shrub from 1936 to 2017. And then we also created a hypothetical future model that would represent what happens if each topoedaphic location was able to reach its quote unquote theoretical max. So if we did nothing, we just let this system go and reach that maximum. And then from there, we created habitat models based on like line of sight for pronghorn, and we tracked how these could change over time. What's really interesting about this, you can see the southern half of this field site has mostly been resistant to encroachment, and therefore has been the one source of high quality pronghorn habitat at this field site. And you can see in the future, we may predict this actually may not become encroached. So from a management standpoint, you could get this and say, okay, what areas used to be high quality habitat? Let's focus treatment there. Or maybe the southern half will be the most cost-effective area to keep pronghorn habitat open and high quality. So maybe we focus all of our brush management down here and then let this northern half turn into a savanna and increase different habitat types in that location. All right, so through a lot of these talks, we've talked about, this time component, this spatio-temporal aspects of the encroachment process, the impacts it has, the landscape issues, these adaphic controls that they have on it, how it's not even, but we're really missing like one component in all of this research, and it's the human dimension. It's like, what do people actually want from the landscape? Because ultimately, when we're planning management, we're the ones that decide where do we treat, why should we treat, how often we should treat. So part of our research as well is Steve and I, we looked at this list of ecosystem services out here. And we went out and talked to a bunch of people on the landscape and we said, hey, which one of these ecosystem services do you guys think is most important to manage for? And we identified 7 of these services. And from there, we distributed a survey across southern Arizona to a number of different stakeholder groups. And we asked them to rank, this list of services. There were 7 total. And they were shown these boxes with 4, and then they had to choose, which one is most important here, which one is least important here. And then from that, we could analyze what people's perceptions were on what was most important. And this is kind of shocking to us. So if you look at the bottom here, you have state or share of preference. So that's basically saying, what is the percentage that this stakeholder would choose this ecosystem service as the most important? And we have our pooled group. So all the respondents up on this top left, you have education and researchers, government and land managers, you have nonprofit folks, ranchers and landowners, and then you have just residents and people who recreate out there. It's kind of an aha moment because we assumed, these ranchers would really be valuing brush management and conserving rangelands for forage production. But we found, at least with our sample group in southern Arizona, that biodiversity and erosion control are what people are really wanting to use brush management to measure. So implications with this, if you're planning a brush management project that's expensive, may not get public support if you're focusing it just on forage production in southern Arizona, you could frame this as like, hey, we're going to increase pronghorn. And then from there, you may get support from all of these different stakeholder groups and prevent litigation from happening or pushback on these projects or government money being spent to do that. So kind of main takeaways from this is shrub encroachment, brush management both have positive and negative impacts. There's trade-offs to this, to ecosystem services. And the direction is really dependent on the type of topoedaphic characters on the landscape. So a lot of Steve's work that he's done has really laid the ground floor for us to move forward in this, to start implementing, as Joel was saying, let's implement better carbon data into these models to make them more relevant, more accurate, and more sustainable for the future. Brush management, this has been mentioned a couple times, should not be looked at as like a one-time solution, but should be a subscription. and where you want and what you want from the landscape. It should be tailored as a tool to get that from the landscape. And then moving forward, we can't neglect what humans actually want. So from there, kind of the bookends, Joel at the one side and me at the second, at the end. But yeah, thanks a lot.
Question for Scott, then we'll sort of go to a general discussion.
We had like 116, but the total came down to like 106, which was about 20 from each group, and very even, which is actually for Southern Arizona not bad. We don't have a ton of ranchers in that area. Something we've talked about is I think it's an area for future research to really look at. And we did some follow-up interviews with ranchers because it was kind of shocking with like biodiversity. And then we also like maybe asked the wrong question. How do they actually view biodiversity? But ranchers are smart people. They're on the landscapes. They kind of realize, look, if we increase, floral diversity in that area, we're going to get really good branch lands. So if we manage for pronghorn, we open it up for pronghorn, we're also going to have really good branching lands. So yeah, and it's interesting because there's pushback from, why are we treating this for forage? So if you tailor that to like, this is bird conservation, or this is pronghorn. So.
Great, Scott. So I really appreciate speakers. You guys, nice job, especially at staying on time. And I specifically asked when we started, keep the stories to a minimum, because we could have easily just done the stories part. But I do have one now that Austin and Scott, now that you guys are pretty much finished, and Steve, I assume you're not recruiting any new graduate students. I was Steve's first graduate student. I was more or less on time, got through. And just as I was leaving, Steve got a new graduate student. I'm not going to mention the name, but Steve got a new graduate student, incredibly intelligent person, really smart, in the sort of sense that other people like me are jealous of him. Innately smart, but also notoriously difficult to focus. And you'll probably figure it out who it is. And it was, for a guy like Steve, that's very frustrating. And I think, Rod, you probably were the third leg of that triangle. So, Steve had been struggling with that. I had left and started working, and I came back for graduation in the spring and was back in College Station, and it was, pretty big weekend. So Steve and I found a little bit of time to be by ourselves, and of course, we drank a lot. And, we were standing out in the parking lot there, double days, saying, blah, 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 and it's good and all this stuff. And Steve said, I asked him how it was going. He said, oh man, this new person is really frustrating. He said, he's really smart. He's really smart, but it's taking too much time to get the focus. And he said, I've made up my mind. I'm not going to get any more of these really smart people. I'm going to stick with people like you. So, and I didn't want to tell that to all these other people before they started to be your students and postdocs, because they may have prejudged the situation. I think it would only really be fair if, Steve, if you want to respond, fine. If you don't, that's fine. I certainly didn't make that part of the deal, but if you've got any kind of a response, certainly glad to have it.
Well, I don't have quite a journey between the mind itself. You might have surmised and overview. I'm a jack of all trades and I've been blessed and fortunate to get the right people working on questions of and get their expertise bringing that to bear on questions. A lot of the work we've done has been because of the collaboration, really, and
I say lucky, I mean lucky. And I tell myself to the kind of things that we have to be. I grew up on farm, work with Colin Day, I look at walking. This isn't work. It's all possible because of concrete. Thanks all the presenters today. Thanks, Steve. Okay, any general discussion, any questions? Anybody's up for any of the speakers, or, I mean, well, Steve's fair game on this one. I think it's completely fair to say, why didn't you do it this way at this point? Without being critical. So, yes, ma'am. I'd be willing to have anybody try that one. A long way of saying it really does depend. Well, right along with the, yeah. I want to disagree a little bit. Not from the first part that, yes, that's the holy grail of ecology. And there's a couple of ways to go about seeking that grail. And one of them is sort of this backward-looking space for time substitution. And, you know, we're good at that. And mainly thanks to the kind of work that Steve and his colleagues have done. We're really good at that. Looking forward now, if we are in a situation where we're trying to experimentally identify a precise threshold, I think regardless, I mean, and, you know, I've been involved in a couple of them, and one in Australia and one at the Jornada. you better bring a couple of $1,000,000 for an experiment to actually implement a treatment that you think is going to give you a state change or that threshold, and you want to identify that threshold. And if you think about all those combinations that Steve talked about, we're not going to do that. We're just not going to get there. So in one sense, yes, but from a managerial sense, I think that is certainly, we talk about management thresholds, and that is, when is it time to act versus when does the ecosystem actually change? And obviously the time to act is well before the ecosystem changes. And I think our scientific pursuit of that precise threshold has actually been a disservice to management, because we've convinced people that there's this sort of moment that things change. And really, they should have acted 10 years ago. And people are sitting around going, well, if I could just get a little more data, I can take action. But the reality is you need to take action way before that. So, yeah, I think there's, and I think you can treat that differently and say, well, one's a ecological threshold and one's a management threshold. And just, you're a manager. It doesn't matter where the ecological threshold is. If you don't do something now, you're there. Brad.
Well, our experience, and we've been very semi-arid, is that grazing management, the carbon levels are not so low. So separating the signal from noise is a problem. And a lot of times we found is that the grazing management has a relatively smaller impact on the carbon dynamics than the really got to say what our longest term vegetation and then part of that, again, depends on things like fire integrate, kind of touches back on the threshold. You know, a lot of our work with dispersal, seedling establishment in the context of the plant control. I think the takeaway message that I kind of have is that grazing management doesn't keep up with anything, because when you see to get into the site, they're going to terminate, they're going to establish. The grazing management is a factor, is then how much fine fuel might be on the ground to carry a fire. So if you can relax grazing periodically to allow fuel to accumulate to get a fire in every 5 to 10 years, ostensibly you might avoid the transportation. If you don't do that, take fire out of the system because of the grazing. And all of a sudden, you put in a foothold on it. And what the fuel on how we get up to fire that's coming up. So, you know, it's a different kind of thing. And so all these things, you know, related to the legislation, I think some of the carbon claims,
Always the diplomat. Well, not always, but mostly. Any other questions or comments or points for discussion? Well, I've got one, Dawn, based on a figure, I think you and Jay both used it, maybe Heather had it in there as well as this one. And I'm, you know, I think this is one of those figures that tells us a lot. It's a fairly simple figure, but it tells us a lot, and we need to deal with it. Because when we look at this area right here, we treat shrubs and we see that rapid decline. Everybody wants that. And then we see this lag time in response here. And that, I'm assuming that's forage, but it could be herbage production, but it could be any ecosystem services that's diminished by shrub control. And I know, from a management prescription, from a program, conservation program standpoint, we don't deal with that time lag. We pay people we support them with cost share or whatever to do the brush control, but we act like this right here is going to start right there and automatically increase that, whatever that ecosystem service is. So we don't adjust those economic goals. And Scott, when we come to those ecosystem services, we don't pay any attention to that lag time. What are managers going to do during that lag time that, number one, doesn't make the situation worse? And we've all seen that post-fire, post-brush treatment. We go right back in with the same level of grazing, and we actually degrade the system even further by loss of herbaceous species or whatever, or any other ecosystem service we want to think about. And programmatically, we don't have any way to deal with that. And we are happy to cost share scads of money to put on the brush, but what happens after that? And again, that goes back to this idea about the adoption of that threshold. I mean, we are at that point, we're still operating on the brush side of the threshold. We haven't crossed the threshold, and our management needs to be geared not toward killing brush, but it needs to be geared toward getting back across that threshold. And that, I think that this figure is a little bit misleading in the sense that the difference between time 2 and time 3 is fairly short, but that could, that's 25, 30, 40 years. We don't have people, and we don't have mechanisms, and we don't have programs that allow people to plan for 40 years about what they're going to do to reestablish themselves on the other side of that threshold. And I think that's a place where a lot of this work with carbon and a lot of this work really needs to go into ecosystem services part is, we had, 40 years ago, we adopted this idea of nonlinear change, but we still haven't implemented it. So, disagree, I hope.
Just a historical context of this picture. I've always been an advocate, and I always felt like I needed to read the old literature to understand how we got where we are today. That's been a concern of mine over my career. It seems like a lot of the science that comes out are aware of really what we're doing today is real. So we're reinventing things that we suffer with. The impetus for this figure, it's not something I came up with. That comes out of the stuff that Charlie Cypress and Richard Connor and Wayne Dennis and Rod Heights back in the early 1980s. And it kind of got forgotten. So when we did this paper, this is a way of trying to remind the current community. There's some background here and trying to reference, the papers that led to those stuff. I guess that's one thing on my long days. Don't ignore the early literature. There's a lot of depth. A lot of times we're just defining and putting things into a more conceptual context using new tools that weren't available. Answer questions that those guys back then would have to do.
Okay, any other comments or questions or anything? If not, I'll wind it up. Thank you. And thank you, speakers, especially. Nice job. And thank you, Steve and Gwen, for, like Heather pointed out, it was fun. There was a lot of production, but there was also a lot of fun. So thank you. Thanks, everybody. Good job, Scott.
Yeah, it's okay.
That was excellent.
I just want to work in working fisheries. Now I think about damn shrubs.
You don't, you never look the same again, you know?
I have to run to a lunch meeting at 11:30.
Okay.
Thank you, Joel.
Oh, my pleasure. You guys did a really nice job. And I can, as you're seeking employment, I'd be happy to provide support if I can.
Yeah, thanks. So when do you head back to Las Vegas?
Thursday.
Okay,
Yeah.
great. I'll see you around.
Yeah. Um,
Roast Stephen buying a severe.
that's exactly right. Tonight, I think is the mixer thing, so I'll probably see you there.
Okay. Good
All
to see you again.
All right, see ya.
And during the third, they're in the third. You were talking last. Are you still in? So I don't know. Well, I see the three. Anyway. So I would. You know, I it's so awesome. One of my graduates. Yeah. Yeah, so just mommy shop it out right now. That's great. So I hope like a war. Yeah, about this sheep wagon was built in 1990, and this is the company. And here's all the things that were unique to this company and this wagon. And so they tried to restore exactly what And then they think, we really got to think about the idea that we gotta bring. Like that. Oh, Sam, I mean, I'm not sure. That we, yeah, nice to see Well, we got to do something. Well, I'll tell you what, my experience, I'm so glad I ended up in I learned a lot. It's part of that, partly up there and explain something. You gotta have some strength. It's stuff you think I remember going into thinking like circular and lecturing. Professors like, oh. The night before, I'd be like, I'm gonna have to go back and reread it. The other thing was, they kind of forced me to read on his things. I read. I got into I had to attempt to read that. I didn't really care about it much, but I with papers and then those planted seeds that, you know, when we read them, they're looking at like So you could never predict it. It's not like I got a vision and game plan. Like sort of bouncing off people that I interacted with. And a lot of it we interact with and that is just kind of thinking. Collaboration is always been key. Otherwise, we could get stuck. Collaborate that. It's funny that he might take for granted, but people are going, "Oh, I didn't talk about it." We're talking to them and they're going, "Nah." Thanks again for your. So you're not in Mongolia, you're. You're a long run in Mongolia. Your son? Yeah, he, I think, knows some stuff. They interviewed him for some things. He's part of that team. And, yeah, so I talked to him a little bit about you. I didn't tell him the old stories. Oh, yeah, it's pretty an international incident, right? I remember that. Didn't know what else. Didn't know which end to go. When that goes, a lot of water in the grid, man.
Stay in touch with Connor.
Yeah.
We went to Alaska on a cruise with him. I'm thinking about the one time over to Italy.
Yeah.
We enjoy it. And we're out there. Yeah, that's home life. They built it the night. Out there. They still have their life, or at least they did. They still have their own College Station because they go back. I don't know if they'll keep it in. He really likes it out there. That account from the television. Good time. I've seen eight. I think going through first method.
Yes,
Well, I didn't know. Risky, I got retired.
Risky involvement.
Yeah, well,
Hired this was the last semester, I think.
you know, you kind of go. You know, maybe. You know, you do just about everybody. And he kind of says, I'm on, still on now.
I got it. Well, see you guys around. Yes, I do. I remember you. Great. I remember, you know, here's where I was. Well, context was, you guys are laughing at every one of my. For some reason, yeah. You're right. Well, do something like that, take me vote. Sometimes you need to put some stuff. So literally, maybe not as we went along. I waited.
Grass. Well, or
I write it. So we're. So we have to wait for the food plan. And then the letter, you give them a couple, and then the letter sits there. Or it got fair, and then fair, well, then we got around why. Oh, yeah, that's fine. Okay.
It's not.
Yeah, no big
Yeah.
It's all good. I send their second.
Yeah, let's see.
I mean.
So have we been here before? Or is it? That's gonna be.
They all have.
So you.
And not next year, but the after, talk about teaching practices and best ways to integrate that.
Yeah.
We can try to say. Next time you're up there, that's great.
Yeah.
So.
But I can tell you where I
You do. So you regularly place out like. Yeah. And I've been thinking about other ways to like very few And there's other. And could we do the dynamic flag? What is on else?
It's presentation of how much soil temperature or, you know, what's really important. Unfortunately, sort of because I feel like we really need to actually do better. Like, I'm seeing enough of the data, and it's just how it works, but like, I feel like I know, but I have to. But there's no departmental factors that would relate to how right, the reproductive technology, then do still give our driving. Yeah, exactly, and I think it's gonna be like winter, rain, the grass. Like much longer time. You know, there would be a lot of people on it, like, it's not just like use work with yeah. Yeah. Well, I'll tell you.
It's like one of the reasons.
There's still been, and even like a pair of was larger in 1997, because I was enjoying my journal. So I'm like, like either phonology or some of the words. Yeah, like it's water. It's either in time or space. Like right. Now that's.
I got there.
We're getting stuck. Yeah. Anyway, but so that applies to what you just said. So okay, awesome. Yeah, and when actually what great question. I'm curious too. Are there like they want to start shopping or no, there's one, not two X speeds.
We can fast forward to
Oh, okay, that was. Okay.
Okay.
And I never used to that. Great. Great. I'm fine.
It's real general, 30,000 foot. And stuff. Finally got George. Yeah, well, he was.
Unfortunately, the mosquito plant,
Yeah, I don't know if you've heard that. It's
just
a thing.
a light green
Study.
spot.
Oh, good. Well, that's. There will be no lost advance. Good. Thank you. I'll get around.
So that's one of the.
Yeah, just put a lot of cows on there. Really high density cows.
How's it on that?
You know, the short line stuff. Yes.
So. Lunch. So time.
I would think so.
They're invited by.
Have you been to Salem? They still have a Salem. Bees would be so funny when you use that Salem. Buying one.
That's out of like. Yeah. That and
Yeah, I mean.
Okay, the five structures on the city. Yeah, okay, yeah, I do need to go by and see. That'll be true.
After the last. And
So that's where it come out. And then I.
Because you were able to.
Scott and Mike.
do something.
You ever seen?
Yeah.
So you have extra tickets, we had dividends, right, we were trying. Yeah, yes. So who did you get the
The
tickets?
first one up to be hurt, Jim's feet. Chris's card. He jumped me about it.
They tried to get up. Oh, God. I know they have to.
You can see
Because
it.
here I am, I'm like, bitch.
Ralph.
But here it is again. You know, they've been to Boise, she says, oh, I would like to fast restaurant there. And I've been to put it on. I need to know the name of the place. to put it. Oh, okay.
Yeah, yeah. Good job. I was.
Oh, man.
Yeah.
Oh,
We did a lot of things.
I mean, he loves that one road. She probably says when the student has no. I would go. So. Yeah. Yeah, I could have run to someone so much. Oh, I think we're walking. Oh, wow. Okay, all right. Just like the figure it's gonna be.
Yeah.
Not run. I'll walk to the other, depending.
Finally got his first.
Someplace called Monterey.
Got some money for this.
I might go. I'm sure I need to like. Yeah.
I don't know why.
I mean,
Yeah.
well, yeah, Yeah, I walked through there yesterday, yeah.
Well, so.
And I wrote it, I can explain it, they were all upset. NRCS. This one.
This day, right, is tomorrow. Yeah. Today's, it was all right, it was Monday, the day after. See, had to do other directions. I can give you those. Chaos. I can give you-
If they can get by with it 2 places, they'll do it again. If they don't get by, they go.
Yeah.
It's something else.
So this is Tuesday.
You know, and,
We voted, yeah. we voted.
I will. So here's one of those songs, like what Katie said, and we had some. experience on time.
Okay, I'm gonna get her and say.
He told me once.
And I
he didn't
can ask
tell me,
my-
but one of the guys told me.
Friend meeting
He
is
gave me a rough
those
time.
questions that back to the number at Boise State, but I can, I should take the media back.
Yeah.
So I can also get along.
Yeah.
Yep, so I'll catch up with you, I've got your phone number, so the communication.
Yeah, we used to.
You got it.
Yes.
Larry Chen.
Joel's got it.
Yeah.
We'll see you tonight,
Two guys.
right?
Remember, anything, right?
That's the only night available. All right.
Yes.
Happy lunching.
Well,
We might.
it was good.
Where?
It was so nice.
Oh, I said without. Now, let's.
Yeah, not only do we have. It was
The warehouse
stakeholders.
place and its food court has a lot of
I was getting-
things.
Without
We
saying.
have changed.
That was good. That was one of the things I had on.
Panda Express is closed.
I recall. It's people.
So far, let's see, well, I'm really interested in that. In that warehouse thing, because I like the concept of you go there and there are all these
They
things.
have the Japanese, they have.
Yeah. Yeah, whatever strikes you. And that's where I don't have a zone entity at basket. I doubt it's burning desires for basket, so we're gonna get that tonight.
They were gonna use it to settle some lawsuits.
Absolutely, I have a giant got land. Where's that?
I'm gonna hit the rest of the room one more time.
He's got, I know he's got a short thing.
Losses. Didn't want to-
Oh, he does,
yeah.
And he's got something on
Who did it well.
Yeah, he's got- You can see Australia.
Australian. Yeah.
We'll stay.
So he might, it might be a lunch thing that he's doing.
And we got along well with.
Eating lunch?
Oh, really?
You know, if it is,
He has disappeared.
yes, so.
Come down and
Within
pray.
Of course.
He needed a horse. We could call out and say,
As he is wont to do.
Yeah.
Oh, good. He is good.
Yeah.
Let's go.
But we finally have two.
Yeah. I have everything to three, so we can. Alternative.
Oh, great.
Oh, is it?
In a culture.
Oh, we,
I know, what are they gonna do? Sorry.
This thing has a.
he's on.
Pretty strong word on it.
Makes all the difference in the world.
Because I hear it. Under this, oh,
Makes all the difference in the world.
and if I knew I needed to come to the iron and the gravity that we got. I am.
Well,
We don't want to go into that. It's an excuse.
yeah.
Well, very nice. Nice to meet you. Yeah, thank you.
I'm gonna go.
It's a good place.
Yeah, it is. There's good.
We love it.
Yeah.
Now you can bring these.
Oh.
2.5 years. Yeah.
Yes.
Are you gonna?
There's a lot of. After and Scott.
It's,
You don't got to.
I think so.
And I feel like I've already audienced them, so.
Yeah, they did a great job.
Assessment as well. So, anyway, that's the students, get to meet the rangers. Yeah, the rangers were having field days, and then we've got some of the students presenting at some of the field days this month.
Cool. So there's a lot of interaction there, yeah.
Yeah, it has been harder to get the 4-H and FFA leaders kind of get going on it. It's been a challenge, but
Going on using some of the or helping to build the curriculum.
they're just so busy with
Yeah.
showing and stuff. It's
Yeah.
hard to add something different to their
Repertoire, yeah. So we have some new 4-H connections or,
We do,
yeah,
but yeah, we had a songbird. I don't know what your situation is, because I came in at the end of that conversation, but. A songbird Institute for Science Education is, are you familiar? Okay, so we work with the songbird. They developed a bunch of lesson plans. And we.
for K through 12.
Yeah, for K through 12. And we figured as extension, it's probably our job to reach out to the 4-H and FFA folks. And so we did that. We just co-lead all the 4-H, FFA and the Farm Bureau out of the classroom folks. And we heard back from, I think Paige said about a 27% response rate.
That's awesome.
And they were all super excited.
Oh, good.
Oh, yeah, we'll send the slides on my teachers.
Yeah. I think the part of the problem has maybe been we're asking for time to do the activity with their students. For the rep part, and then also like taking them to the field and it's time, yep. And we have money to travel, but I think that's with some of it. It depends on if it's an FFA leader or if it's a 4-H leader. Some of the 4-H leaders are just so overwhelmed, because a lot of, like, I have a friend that's a 4-H leader in New Mexico, and she's the ag and 4-H extension person for her county. So she's doing showing, she's doing any kind of ag questions that she gets, field days, like it's just a lot for them.
Yeah, and extension book, that's like a nationwide issue. Extension people are really overextended.
Tell me that.
So part of our proposal was really integrating like the educational aspects back into the research and then extension into research. So like we had a lot of, it wasn't too bad of a spaghetti diagram, but there were like bi-directional flows where so we've been puzzling, how do we get, how do we really deliver on that for education? What we've learned from our K through 12 education process is like feeding back into the research, and the best that we can come up with so far is like, as we build we're moving toward this knowledge system, like the Southwest knowledge system, like a set of tools and a library and stuff, and really using lessons that we've learned from the students or feedback from the students about what to put in there is kind of the best. We build it as our rancher, our producers and consumers of tomorrow in our proposal. Yeah. So anyway, so we're gonna try to do that. So we're really at Amarillo, like we're really, it's gonna be a workshop, like really focusing in on our, that's our next annual meeting. I think Jean invited you to, is really getting clear on our knowledge system and how that's gonna work. Yeah.
But the extension team compiled all the tools that are already available in the youth industry and found 650 or 500.
We currently have about 580.
Yeah,
Database, and Brianna is in the process of overhauling that, because what we discovered is that many of these tools, especially the apps, apparently are very ephemeral. Or just like, they're a flash in the pan, they're gone, like, because Toby's only 2 years old.
we did not
And
get tools.
I just randomly,
Yeah.
went on a search for something, because I was looking for a tool.
Yeah.
And like 2 or 3 of the apps,
Can't find them.
can't like, forgotten.
So I was at the Rangeland Partnership meeting, what was the Outreach and Extension Committee meeting for SRM? And the people, most of the people that are on there are also Rangeland Partnership folks. And they had that, they were trying to compile a list as well on what range docs, I think it was in the range doc, they have a new page called range docs where they put documents in and annotated them and anyway, it's supposed to be a better way to search for information. But they had a spot to search for tools, but their list isn't as big as yours. I know. So congratulations, but
Range docs. It's
Range
that's an
docs.
SRM.
so Jason Carl. would be the
Okay.
Contact for it. Yeah.
If I can interject something. Well, Andres. Where did Andres?
I'm gonna text him and just tell him that
Did he get lost?
he probably got.
Yeah.
But he generously offered to kind of take the lead, and ran on a joint symposium in the range meetings next year. And I think that's a great idea. And I'm just wondering, how do we make it where it's of interest to more than just our little. Yeah. And I don't have an answer. to that.
Yeah, no, it's a very good question.
And you have any insight or with integrated? You know, our projects are one strength, as they say unique, but there aren't that many projects that really integrate research, extension,
Yeah,
and education. I don't know if we want to project what we've done as real success stories or something.
yeah, that's
Or challenges, or where's rangeland management going in the future? But it would be great to fill up a room and not just have it be our two teams coming together. I know you're about to say something and it's something.
Well, I was thinking, I don't really have a sense, but I think given the topics, there ought to be other people interested. And especially now, those projects are going for a while, so there's some good reward tangible outcome. If they show and publicize it, well, I wouldn't imagine there are quite a few people interested.
And I guess, well, a possibility is that the speakers don't just have to be full, I mean, it would be. I wonder if it would be interesting if there might be some outside speakers that might be sort of a draw.
Yeah,
Anyway, I don't have an answer to that, but I think it's something that's really important to think about, is how do we make a symposium that fills up the room.
so what would you say, I say the question, so Andre, did Dr. Siddles get waylaid by some no offense people? Oh, we're starting to room,
It's gone now.
You texted him.
I did, yeah, I didn't know it.
And then, of course, Ben and others with Andre's encouragement, just got this $1 million grant with the climate house.
Excellent.
And I
But
know
we're not supposed to announce it.
oh, sorry. Oh, goodness, I've been bragging all over I know that's maybe trying to develop synergy with the climate hubs as well might be.
Well, that way it is climate hub partnership, right?
Great.
And it's really building on our current projects, so it's really,
Yeah.
so I think we should expand.
That's
But
pretty
it's-
cool.
It's never heard of those
I hadn't heard of, I'm guessing it's probably the southern plains.
in northern.
Or Southern, yeah, so
We've got it, right?
doesn't come.
I said, yeah, so.
You're close to the grant. Hi. But that makes sense to go with this if we did do it, because it's where the part of that is that we're having fellows.
I'm very see if I can just recap, and then maybe if you have a vision. But we're wondering, we're all on board about this joint symposium, I think that's great. The question I put up was, how do we make this a really broad interest? How can we fill up a room? And then also, what just occurred to me, it's not just synergy between our two groups, it's synergy with the climate hubs. Sure. So it's potentially much more than maybe our two groups. I would certainly be supportive of that.
I'm gonna ask a question just because I feel like I wasn't there for maybe the beginning of the conversation with this. What is the end of the day goal of the symposium? Is it to share our research that we've got so far, or?
I'll give you my version, which is a version. Hasn't really changed completely, but from the perspective of the hubs, anyhow, so it seems as though both projects are doing really interesting things, research and outreach and so on, associated with adaptation, climate adaptation, sustainability, how we look at it. Ranching systems, beef production, what have you, in the Southwest and plains, or the Southern plains, and so and the education side as well, of course. So it seemed like a sort of a really nice opportunity to get both teams together to around this topic of tools for climate adaptation, ranching systems in the Southwest and the plains, or we're just throwing this out there as a possibility, and sort of doing it as a symposium and probably eventually having some sort of an end product that would make it worth everybody's while. So maybe some sort of a synthesis paper that could then be translated by the hubs and and used as outreach, or
I see. So
work with
so we could actually start thinking about synthesis paper immediately.
So maybe if that would help structure the symposium, it might be one way to approach it. But basically what we're thinking is something that would be a win-win for for both caps, for the hubs as well. And just see, you know, if by working together on this, we can sort of create some synergies that might eventually also lead in ideas for next steps as far as funding. But so that's sort of a general idea, but obviously,
Something that just occurred to me. I'm sorry that it seems like I'm assuming these USDA SAS programs are going to continue. We could also serve as models for other teams, other rangeland teams that have an interest in getting one of these grants. I don't know if
Maybe one of the talks would be.
I was thinking about that earlier as well, just these are probably only two range
Yes.
camps that, just showing how well that works. And what's the approach that could be interesting to many people in that aspect, but also listening to Andreas also thinking, because the two project covers quite a range, it's a bit different. And if you just highlight both the success post project, symposium, that takes a lot, and it may take some effort to really to have a sense of to have a job in some way. I was thinking another possible approach maybe, as Andreas says, if we take an angle from the climate adaptation and so on, not necessarily talk about everything we did in both projects, but taking just framing certain actually good part of it, almost all those that we do in that theme. I think that's a broader theme than you were thinking about bringing other people, even or USDA leadership to talk about it.
Those are great ideas.
So, one of the, I really like that, and one of the things that the hubs are very interested in. So they're interested in these efforts, but also in developing tools. And so I know that on both sides there are very sort of practical applications that that would basically be tools for adaptation for the folks that are on the ground as well. And so that slant as well would be great. I mean,
what about along that line, given that nature of these set of things from the two project, that lends well in terms of product in some sort of white paper. People in the region would say, working on climate adaptation, here sort of here's the what do we understand, research says, what works that kind of showing, and there's the tools. When we mentioned maybe USDA would be quite interesting products like that.
I think most definitely. I think we could. One thing that we were talking yesterday with Sky a little bit. One thing that surprised me a little bit wearing this new hat was how little folks that I chat with usually know about the climate hubs in this community. And so I thought, well, okay, here's a community where I can say, oh, the climate hub, oh yeah, sure. So, I was kind of with you guys. Yeah, so I've explained it a bunch of times, which is fine. That's sort of what we need to do, but anyhow, this would also be an opportunity, as you said, for also showing in real time. This is sort of one of the things that the climate hubs are supposed to doing.
If we went with the idea that we at least have one speaker that kind of talks about how this worked into the sustainable systems part, maybe just having like what that.
Hello. You guys know Morgan?
Hi. No, hi, I'm Sherry.
Morgan is our extension. And Roberto has also been involved in the project, sensing ecology,
Cool. Nice.
Just to recap, we're trying to brainstorm a bit about a symposium for next year, and how can we make it not just relevant for what we're doing, but relevant for sort of broader community that participates in these kinds of meetings.
We're in a different cap, sustainable Southwest coordinated agricultural projects.
And so we're the only two, I believe, range related. You call it a CAP. It's the SAS. Oh, is it?
Or coordinated agricultural.
Is it a CAP?
But so that's the type of project the census program.
Yes,
Yep.
you guys call it a SAS?
We call it the Prairie Project. That's the only thing we
App is like the old term, right, and then they changed to calling them SaaS projects.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, we're just behind the times.
Because other people call it his lollipop or the corn cob cat. G-cab. Well, I mean, she's not here.
But other people in the long-term agro ecosystem research effort, they'll refer to theirs as caps to like wheat cap or corn cap.
Yeah, I think NEPA still calls them caps, but that is the project type, and the sustainable agricultural systems is the actual program that funds these caps.
Yeah.
Does
so
that
we-
make
yeah, we
sense?
do
An
have
acronym,
our
another
heads,
acronym, but
yeah.
yeah. All right, but
Anyway, yeah, but we're, Southwest.
Well, so we're wanting to develop
Yeah.
synergy between the two caps, but also the other is climate hub. I'm basically leader of one of those and.
I mean, I think that they go together because they were both meeting the goals that called for, right? I mean, they're doing it in very different ways, but they're both, that's why they got funded. So I mean, I feel like that's an easy way to bring them together, but.
So I feel like I need to look at a map, sort of like your sphere of influence, like what would you say?
It's the southern, it's the.
Nebraska,
central side of-
Kansas, Oklahoma, and Texas.
Yeah. So the way that we link the Southwest with that area is like through a supply chain perspective, like so we study this heritage from the cattle and then precision ranching, for experts here, and then we look at how those ranch level practices have outcomes that cross the whole supply chain, like all the way up through like grain finishing. But then, or grass finishing in the Southwest, and then. But then we're now really starting to think about Ogallala water aquifer use for those, for grain finishing and how, but I know that you do other aspects of management there too. So I wonder if mixing, if like, just think about a conceptual framework, like how the systems link sort of in a supply chain or like telecoupling kind of framework. That's kind of where my mind goes, but.
Yeah, we're not doing anything with finishing cattle.
But the cattle that are on the ranch and the other species need to get finished somewhere, right?
Well, just in a nutshell, what we're focusing on are, well, we're thinking about but what are the environmental problems that agricultural production systems are facing around this? Increasing woody plant encroachment, increased heat waves, and then increased wildfires. We have this idea that the combination of both pirate herbivory and mixed animal grazing, we can address those issues in a cost-effective way. Basically, reintroducing these disturbances that grassland regimes have evolved under. In a nutshell, though, this entire region is converting to shrubland. Texas is already flipped, Oklahoma's well on the way, Nebraska's accelerating, South Dakota, 30 phases, it's kind of in a nutshell. What can be done now? Keep these other grasslands from flipping to woody plants. And there are a number of constraints for people to actually incorporate these kinds of management strategies, even though we know they work, just a reluctance to use fire.
Try anything but an Angus
Yeah.
cow.
So anyway,
from the outside, a little bit from having stood on the outside for about a year and a half, it seems to me that, so the Prairie Project is addressing problems on the ranch that are inherent to Great Plains rangelands. And the Southwest Beef Cap is addressing problems on the ranch that are inherent to desert. And so it seems to me that on the ranch end, there's this connection, and there are obviously very different tools because the problems are different. Some problems are similar, but I mean, there are problems that difference to me, standing, knowing a little bit about the Prairie Project and a little bit more about the Southwest Beef Cap, but standing on the outside, it's super interesting to see sort of this really regional thing, across the Southwest and the plains, and these efforts to use tools that, as you said, Brad, are working to address those problems. And in my mind, that's why I think it's sort of that and trying to
Yes, that
something,
makes-
sort of tying them together. Of course, beef connects the two.
Yes,
The
my mind
plains
just-
to South.
Yeah, yes.
But-
But, so, and then something you said about adoption rates, so it's like we have this information that these things work, but then adoption is lagging behind, so why? And I think that's a issue or a question that's like, endemic. To the society, so everybody's asking those same questions, like we have these innovations and technologies that work, so why is adoption lagging behind, and then one solution is having this coordinated agricultural project with extension and education to kind of address, understand adoption rates.
So Sherry, if I may follow up, yeah, I think that makes sense. The adoption piece is really the challenge. That's a common theme here. And sounds like we're not only follow up, but yours. It sounds like our focus is really about looking on the land. And yours more was the animals. And but you're right, just adoption is key. And that's broad, pretty broad one too, that level may relevant to many others. Another theme will be still going back to what you said, if we think about climate adaptation in semi-arid rangeland of the US, that's common.
Yes.
That's common for both of us. And not everything we do, but most things we do can fall under that really well.
Climate adaptation.
Yeah, in this region of rangeland, that probably meets the interest of the agency really well too.
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah, it's an interesting character because we do definitely do a lot of animal work, but looking at their distribution on the landscape, so that's where and then the implications for like.
See, we don't do that at all.
We do distribution, but with fire.
Yes, but it's not about animal themselves.
Yeah.
I don't know, we, just by listening now, seems that it's interesting to talk about
Yeah.
from the prairie to the place, what it takes to do the.
Oh, that's nice.
We're talking about how we produce the cattle, but then the whole supply chain is such a big investment in making sure that that cow gets to your vendor, or
Yes.
to the buyer. And there's a lot of other things that are involved there that look beyond the scale of those areas. And thinking about that into the future is going to be wild.
Yep.
If you look at the Ogallala and you look at the semi-arid areas where you guys are located, I think that the whole connecting is everyone, everybody's an image.
Yeah.
Consumption and everything. All connected online.
Yep, and we did, that was the name of our symposium last year as well. It was like pasture to plate for Southwest. So, yeah. I wasn't there. Because it was dead, but it was like, there were a bunch of people there. Yeah, and on Zoom and stuff, but yeah.
I will say, I think most of them were there for the producer panel. So if we wanted to draw a big audience, it might be worth getting some producers, advisory.
Oh, that's a good idea, actually, because both caps probably have strong advisory for members. The Southwest Beef Cap has folks that are pretty involved, and that is a good ingredient as well, I guess. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, on Zoom, I think folks were there.
I just know I was watching people come in,
Yeah.
and honestly, we got a whole bunch more people come in, right?
At the producer panel, yeah, that was nice.
And I
Yeah.
was just in a session this morning that had a producer panel. I mean, all of the ones have been packed, but this one was also very packed.
It's cool.
So, yeah.
I was gonna suggest, and I don't know if this is out there, is that maybe, I mean to say, we don't need to decide this today or this in about a year, but maybe it would help. If, I know that some of the Prairie Project folks are coming to this Southwest Speak.
Yes.
And it would probably be good if some Southwest Speak folks could attend the Prairie Project's annual meeting to sort of get acquainted with what all is and keep thinking about these items. No, I think that's a good idea.
That's great.
And some sort of, well, I think the deadline to submit symposium proposals is April sometime or what?
For SRM?
Yeah,
No, I think it goes on July or.
Yeah, yeah.
summer, okay, so the summer, no, better still.
Way better.
The only catch is any budget through committees and things like that needs to be submitted with March.
Yeah,
But that's more committees, like.
yes, but if there's, if there's a money ask associated with it.
Yeah.
But actually submitting a proposal is, we probably have time to do something. And you know, if you all think this is a bad idea, that's
No, we
fine
I
too.
like it.
No, I mean, we don't wanna push this,
I
but.
like the idea, like all of these ideas, first like the idea of the home climate hubs as part of this. And the umbrella, the UPS, like rangeland and changing. Adaptation. Adaptation, yes, I like that.
That would work fantastically with the house.
Yeah, I think both our work really.
Yes.
I agree. And we want to make it a little, want to put another, maybe another spin on it too. I don't know why, but I feel like SRM is like, that's like the whole usually is adaptive. I don't know. So adaptation. So no offense to the hubs. But it's like, I feel like that's pretty much bread and butter of range management anyway. So we'll want to think about also sweeping the pot with like suggestions on getting NIFA money to look at it and using education and extension as like the integration as like a solution, like a more of a solution based part of that. If that, does that make sense? Like, yeah.
I think it would be just to follow up on that. I think people would find it interesting in terms of what is it that we think made our projects compelling, this really super competitive environment. In our case, I think it was certainly a big part of that was the innovative education component that Ben and others put together.
Yeah.
But maybe just reflecting a bit on. Well, I don't know, how many people are interested in getting a SAS proposal? Probably quite a few.
Yeah.
But it takes a lot to really actually. I don't know, Bertha, you think that'd be interesting? But how many early career people are out there who really not go for SAS proposal? At least the ones I know are having to get their hands.
Yeah. So some practical tips or and of like maybe pulling them together. Yeah, no, it was that our extension and education were, I mean, so strong, such a strong part of that.
Did you go to the meeting last year that took it on?
No, Jean and Glenn Duff went. So yeah.
Ben was there. And our projects are really quite different than a lot of the other ones that are
Is that so?
funded, yeah.
Yeah, more traditional production of agriculture and also kind of ag engineering side of things.
Yes.
Yeah. Yeah, sorry, miss, I was still on the travel. Yeah.
There is one other range, SAS cap that's being funded since ours, these were funded, and it's one out of Utah State with funding of.
Oh, yeah.
But they're just starting out, so.
Yeah.
Well, wouldn't it be interesting to invite them to be a part of it?
Yeah, I'm sorry, I missed it. What's the project? This is a project out of Utah State and Pontiac is the PD on that one. And what they're basically doing is they are planting islands of lakeland